Hello and welcome to Miniage Painting. Before I get into the video, I want to thank everyone who has subscribed to my channel so far. I really appreciate each and every one of you. I've enjoyed making these videos immensely, and I can't wait for the future of this channel. Thank you once again. For anyone new, a subscription helps me incredibly. Without further ado, let's get into this. I started my mini painting journey about 4 years ago. Winter of 2019, I had talked with some of my friends about Warhammer and what faction I should begin with. I've always been a huge fan of magic, so they told me about the Thousand Sons, a faction of people gifted with magic abilities called Psychers. That sounds awesome, so I decided to buy that starter set. That starter set came with some Rubric Marines, some bird people called Zangors, and one of the strongest Psychers in the lore, Azek Ahriman. Further to be referenced as just Ahriman, this dude had a really cool model, and I couldn't wait to paint him as a new painter. This kickstarted my journey into Warhammer. Looking back on him, I have a lot of fond memories of using him in games of 9th edition, and looking at his really cool model in my painting collection. So, with 10th edition now here, and good old Ahriman being better without his disc, I decided that I would buy a new model and build and paint him with my current skills to see a comparison of how I painted almost 4 years ago. Let's get into it. Starting out with one of the most important steps, building the model. So let's do a quick sprue montage. I made sure to clip away from the model in the first go of cutting pieces, to try and save the model from warpage that might occur when cutting it out too close. I've had this happen to previous models, so let's quickly cut the rest of these pieces off. Now time for cleaning mold lines. These will become unsightly and stand out greatly if any are left over while painting. It's always a good idea to be careful in this step, as you don't want to cut yourself accidentally. A hobby knife or sandpaper is the tool for this. With all the parts cleaned up, it is time to start gluing things down. For this, I'm using Tamiya Extra Thin Cement. You could use any plastic glue that you want. I just really enjoy this brand, as the container is the best I have found. While assembling the model, we should look to fill in gaps in the model that shows up, like this gap on his leg that is fairly noticeable when assembled and painted. To do this gap fill, I'll use some sprue goo. This substance can be made by taking a half full bottle of Tamiya Extra Thin and dumping spare sprue into the bottle. What results is a soupy substance known as sprue goo that is great for filling in gaps. Now that the model is assembled, let's prime it and take a look. It seems like I didn't fully fill in the gap on his leg, so I'm going to take some more sprue goo and coat this section with it. While we are at it, I can check other areas for any missed mold lines. Sometimes the primer color can highlight mold lines better than gray plastic. We really want to make sure there are none before we begin painting. After giving that about 2 hours to dry and fully cure, we can sand it down. I'm using some fine grit sandpaper to get a smooth finish. I should have worked a bit more on this, but I was being impatient and had to start painting or this video would never come out. After another round of primer and a final check for mold lines, we are ready to paint. I'm using color recipes published by the Eavy Metal team over at GamesWorkshop for this model. They are in charge of painting the box art for all of the models you see in GamesWorkshop's lineup. I want to start with the blue armor. For this, I'm using Thousand Suns Blue. The shades will be done by adding some Game Color Royal Purple to our Thousand Suns Blue mixture. Keeping to the sides of the trim and underside of the armor, we want to paint this in all of the places natural shadows would exist. It was during this step that I realized his backpack would be in the way majorly, so I carefully pried this off his back to be glued back on later. A final, deeper shade was achieved by mixing black in with the previous shade mixture. This new mix was used to further darken those shadows. A highlight of Ahriman Blue was made to all the parts where light would catch naturally. This is to help with contrast and can really draw the eye. A final highlight was made by adding some Gauss Blaster Green to the Ahriman Blue. This was only applied inside of the previous highlight and only onto the sharpest edges where light would catch. With the blue done, I want to work on the crimson robes of Ahriman. To start this off, I'm going to make a base of corn red and a batten black in a 2:1 ratio of red to black. The shade was made by taking more black and adding it to the base coat. I then added a lot of water to this and glazed it into the folds of the robe to create a natural shadow. A highlight was made by taking pure corn red and glazing this onto the outer folds of the robe. Glazing is done by taking a lot of water and adding it to the paint, almost diluting it down to tinted water. This leaves behind more of a color tint rather than a full coat. I then added some Ushanti bone to the corn red and applied this to the higher points. But I didn't end up liking this, and later went over that with a straight corn red glaze. Ultimately, having this highlight and then going over it again made a stronger red highlight that I really enjoyed. I am now moving on to the cream inner coat of his robe. I realized now that his head would be in the way for a lot of this part, but I can't easily remove it. Maybe I'll redo this model in another 4 to 5 years as another comparison. Jokes aside, I used many thin coats of Ushanti bone to get solid coverage on this cloak. Shades were done using a few coats of Talaran sand. After the first layer, I went over it with a glaze of Ushanti and Talaran to try to get a nice transition from light to dark. In the end, I feel like it went alright. Let me know how you feel in the comments below. Once that was looking decent, I did the same thing with some Screaming Skull for the highlights. Going back to the crimson base coat, I applied this to the corners of the cloak. This gave it a nice, solid feel. Switching over to metallics, I'm not going to use gold. My Thousand Suns army is bright silver and blue, so I am going to base coat all of the metallics with lead belcher. I have to be really careful here not to accidentally hit the portions that I've already put so much work into. Unfortunately, I did get some metallic paint flicks onto the robe, but those can be fixed fairly easily later. A quick shade of Agrex Earthshade was applied to the shadows of the silver. I did not apply this to all of the silver, as I would need to go over the non-shaded parts with more lead belcher. However, now that the Agrex has dried, I can take some Stormhost Silver and apply this to all the metallics on the sharp edges and portions raised to the light. Metallics completed. Moving on to the gloves, which I base coated with Dark Reaper. This gave me a nice base to work from. The shade I used is some watered down Corvus Black that I glazed into the folds and onto the undersides. Time for the smoky warp effect. A base coat of Gauss Blaster Green was applied to the entire trail. I also applied this color to all the eyes around the model, the staff, belt, shoulder pad, and one of the tassels. I then tried to apply some Sybarite Green to the smoke on the part touching his arm, and halfway down the trail as a shade. This didn't really hit quite right at the time though. I did use this as a first shade for the eyes, and it looked pretty good. The second shade was some Cabalite Green. This color went over the Sybarite on the warp smoke, as well as used as a deep shade for the eyes. With that done, I took Moot Green and applied this to the smoke on Armon's hand. I also used this color to paint slits into the eyes. I was still unhappy with this warp smoke effect, but we'll tackle that later. For now, I'm going to paint some red into the eyes, as well as on the gems around the model with some Evil Sun's Scarlet. Don't be too worried about overpainting with the eyes for the first part. Some overpaint makes the eyes look glowing. A dot highlight of Fire Dragon Blight was made to all of the gems, as well as the inner eye of Ahriman to give it a more sinister, bright red look. With an even smaller dot highlight of white, the eyes and gems were complete. Or so I thought. I didn't enjoy how bright the white was, so I later went back over it with thinned down Fire Dragon, and this eventually made them look better. I think having the white down underneath did help though. While I had it on the palette, I used Ushanti Bone to color the pages of the book. I don't have a recording of this, but I eventually took a mix of Cabalite and Sybarite Green to the entirety of the smoke, leaving the moot near his hand. This made me much happier with the effect than previous. All of the bone was started the same way, by using a mix of Rakarth flesh and Wraithbone that was roughly 1:1. This went over all the parts that would later be bone colored. The horns, the tip of his staff, the skull on his shoulder, and the bird skulls around him. I am going to first paint up the shoulder and the tip of his staff by shading them with a mixture of Corvus Black, Rakarth flesh, and Wraithbone. A 1:1:1 mix of all three colors was glazed on. A final shade was done with some heavily watered down Corvus Black in only the recesses of these portions. After that was done, I did a highlight of Wraithbone by watering it down and glazing it over the whole thing. I left the sockets of the skull alone though. After mixing in some white scar in with the Wraithbone, I had a first edge highlight that I used to bring some white color into the picture. A final highlight of pure white scar was used on the highest points, bringing the colors into a cold white bone look. The other bones, however, got a first glaze of Dryad Bark and Baneblade Brown in a 1:1 mix. Then a recess wash of pure dryad bark in only the deeper crevices. A glaze of Ushanti bone brought some warmth back in. Followed by a highlight of Wraithbone to lighten up these areas. A final punch highlight of White Scar over the top of that meant the bones were finished. All of the leathery bits were base coated with Rhinox hide. This meant the pouch on his staff, the casing of his pistol, and the cover of his book. The leather was then shaded with Nuln oil. While I was at it, I also painted this onto the pages of the book to help show there are many pages there. I quickly took some Eavy Violet and painted this onto the beads that held the bird skull to the staff. Almost finished with the painting. Let's handle all of that cloth. The starting mixture of Thunderhawk blue was mixed with White Scar to give us the base coat for the tassels and the belt around his waist. Progressively adding more and more white to the mixture gave us our highlights, bringing the tassels up to a nice bluish white. Once the highlights were done, I took pure Thunderhawk and did some lines to accentuate that there were multiple wraps around his waist. Now, while I do a bit of cleanup, let's run through the base. I used glue tack to hold Armand down while priming. This made painting easier, as I could remove him as needed. However, this also helps guide us to where he will be standing, as there is a small outline of where the primer did not touch. I am going to start the base off by taking some skulls and gluing them down front and center. A Grelin earth was then applied randomly to the base. This is a crackle paint, which means the more that you apply in certain areas, the larger cracks you'll get. Where I did not apply the crackle paint, I applied some watered down PVA glue, and then sprinkled some desert sand on top of it. After waiting for a day to give the paint time to set, I sprayed it down with black primer. Seeing as this is probably my longest video to date, I'll speed through the base. Using the airbrush simply for time, I base coated the whole with Xandri dust. Covering the sand and mixing a little bit of this color in the border between, I airbrushed some Doom Gold Brown on the sand. A final airbrush of Screaming Skull was used to make the cracks pop. I then brushed some more Screaming Skull onto the skulls. After that, I put some Agrax Earthshade all over the base. I didn't want this to be too overpowering, so I then wicked away some of the heavier pools with a dry brush. A dry brush of Xandri dust was used to bring back some of the warmth to the base. And then a final sparing dry brush of more Screaming Skull meant the base was complete. Painting some black around the rim, we are ready for a grand reveal. I want to give one more thank you to everyone who has been watching, liking, and has subscribed to my channel thus far. I really enjoy making these videos for you all, and I hope to do more fun stuff like this in the future. If you could share this with anyone who might be interested, I would greatly appreciate it. Until next time, I've been Miniage Painting, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.